It's the Yukon Poly Podcast, a podcast where we talk about politics and popular culture. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson. I'm here with Professor Jeffrey Dudas. We are both from Yukon's master's program in politics and popular culture. And today we are going to talk about a little movie called Rogue One.
Rogue One.
Jin, whatever I do it to protect you. So you understand?
I understand.
You want to get out of here?
Our rebellion is all that remains to push back the Empire. You think you might be able to help us?
When was the last time you were in contact with your father?
What is this? It appears he is critical to the development of a super weapon.
If my father built this thing, we need to find him.
All right. How many do I need?
They are requesting a call sign.
It's, Rogue One.
The power that we are dealing with here is immeasurable.
If the Empire has this kind of power, what chance do we have?
We have hope. Rebellions are built on hope.
Rogue One is a prequel to episode 4 of Star Wars, which we talked about last time, so check out that video. And really we want to continue or amend or think again about episode 4 in light of Rogue One and see if Rogue One sheds any different light on the things that we talked about last time. Rogue One is the first of what became known as Star Wars stories. What's your understanding of what a Star Wars story is?
So I think what a Star Wars story is it's supposed to be a semi-canonical entry into the larger Star Wars universe. And so if you think about the 9, the 3 prequel movies, the 3 original movies, and then the 3 sequels, if you think of those as defining the contours of the canon of the Star Wars universe cinematic canon, then these Star Wars stories, Rogue One, the Han Solo movie, the newer Disney streaming series with Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian, those stories are, I think, designed to fill in some of the blank spaces that are left within the larger contours that the 9 core movies define.
Of which there were many, because as I think we said last time, one of the characteristics of certainly the original movies was how much was alluded to, but not properly spelled out.
Yes. So there's a lot of grist for the mill here.
Yes, and Rogue One comes from, rather famously, the first line of the scroll in Episode 4,
yes,
which says something like, "Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base have achieved their first victory against the Empire."
Indeed. And so this is the reference to what we see in Rogue One as the Battle of Scarif.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of interesting things here with regard to Rogue One specifically. One is it's a prequel, and it's a very direct prequel of Episode 4, and it leads almost, entirely crashes into the opening shot of Episode 4. So in Star Wars world, there is only a matter of minutes, I think, between the ending of Rogue One and the start of Episode 4. The second is, as a prequel, I'll be honest with you, I was predisposed to hate this because I hate prequels.
Yeah.
And the problem with prequels is they tell you a story, the ending of which you already know.
Yep.
And so you see, here's the earlier story of Tony Soprano, for example.
Yes.
I wonder if he'll die in this. Well, probably not, because I know that he then goes on to do all the things that I saw in the original series.
And the viewing experience is very difficult, it seems to me, in a prequel, precisely because you are consistently waiting on the thing to happen. or the series of things to happen. And so it's hard to stay in the moment of whatever story is trying to be unspooled.
Yes, and the other tremendous problem I have with prequels, especially if they're in a science fictional universe, is, let's say the original movie is made as episode 4 was in the 1970s, and then the prequel is made sort of 30, 40 years later, and movie technology changes so much that it's almost impossible to recapture the look of the thing that is supposed to be happening after the movie that you're now viewing. And I noticed this particularly with the prequels to the Alien universe. And I remember very distinctly going into Prometheus, which was a Ridley Scott prequel to the original Alien. And Alien was 1979 and Prometheus was 2010 something. And in Prometheus, it looks like a 2010 movie, not like there's no attempt, successful attempt to recapture the look of Alien. And they also have in Prometheus all this technology, like this ability to like map corridors and motion detect and so forth, that you actually think would have been really useful in Alien. And you're like, why didn't they just deploy that technology against the original Alien? And so the thing becomes, the thing undermines the original movie, which I think, to the great credit of Rogue One, does not happen on either score. It doesn't have, in my view, those story problems that prequels have, that there's really no jeopardy because you know that the characters that you're seeing in an earlier time cannot die because you see them in a later time. There's also no problem, I don't think, in terms of visual continuity in Rogue One. Rogue One looks to me like episode 4.
I agree. It looks like episode 4, whereas the Lucas prequels do not look anything like the original trilogy. Right, which piggybacks on your point about the problems with advanced technology. The irony, of course, is that the Lucas prequels, to me, look hokey and childish in comparison to the actual original trilogy. They look fake. And this is, I think, especially true in the second, is that Attack of the Clones, which looks like a child's sort of rendition of what the Star Wars universe might look like in pastels.
Which is very strange, because the original, one of the cinematic legacies of episode 4 was the style of beaten up spaceships and futuristic technology that is made to look old and lived in. And that was tremendously influential over like Blade Runner and the Alien universe, and actually a lot of science fiction since then. It did seem that Lucas completely forgot his original aesthetic idea and what made that movie so successful with the prequels.
Indeed. And there's none of that issue, as you say, in Rogue One. I mean, the other thing that's happening in Rogue One that seems to me that makes it such a successful prequel is that we are getting a whole new set of characters that we then get invested in. And it allows us to not worry so much about how these core legacy characters that are a part of the story, it allows us to not worry so much about what's happening with them. And in fact, I would say one could absent Darth Vader almost entirely from this movie, and certainly the callback at the very end to Princess Leia, and you have the same movie, right? Nothing changes, and the same character arcs exist, the same emotional beats exist. Everything stays contained within this particular story, and that, to me, makes it feel not so much like a prequel, but rather its own standalone thing.
Yes, and the science fiction scholar Jerry Canavan had a nice line which he said Rogue One neatly disassembles itself at the end, and so it leaves no leftover story or no loose threads or loose characters. You don't wonder what's going to happen to Jyn Erso. Why did she never appear in the original movies?
Right.
And because there's a very obvious answer for why she didn't appear in the original movies. There's also, I think, an interesting point in the director of Rogue One, Gareth Edwards, who, it seems to me, grew up as a Star Wars fan and then got to make a Star Wars movie. And he did the things... He did that in an intelligent way, or he took that charge in an intelligent way. I mean, it's a reverential movie. It's a movie that I think shows a deep knowledge of the mythos and the aesthetic of Episode 4. But it's clearly Episode 4 as remembered by him and as he's lived with the Star Wars universe and as he's grown as a filmmaker. So it's entirely kind of aesthetically consistent with Episode 4, and it's consistent with the story. It creates no story problems for Episode 4, but it has a distinctive, I don't know what the right word is, it has its own tone or take on the material, which is different than anything George Lucas would have done. And it doesn't jar for me with episode 4, but it does meaningfully extend, deepen, or just offer a different cut on that universe.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of what accounts for that is that this is a story about ordinary human beings and the ways in which they find themselves enlisted into a culture of war, a culture of conflict that is not of their choosing, that is certainly not of their making. And it's a story in a certain way, it's a small story about human choices and about human development and engagement with one another. And so it matters, it seems to me, deeply for the contours and the success of this storytelling that this is not a great man legacy story that involves the characters that we already know. It's not a story like Star Wars and the future stories will become that fixate upon an elite cabal of actors, elite either in terms of their political influence or their wealth, or elite in terms of their ability to put themselves into mystical communion with this supernatural force. This is a story about ordinary people and about choices, and that makes it feel, it seems to me, very different, but very different in a way that is compelling in its own right.
I agree, and I think we should both say that we both really enjoyed rewatching this movie and have always, I think, held this movie in quite high regard. I didn't like the Han Solo movie. I haven't engaged with, so I can't comment on the TV iterations more recently. But Rogue One, I thought from the start was a really interesting and excellent entry in the.
It's a unique story in the canon, and for all of those reasons.
Yeah,
and it's one that you'd like to see more of. You'd like to see more of that aesthetic.
Yes.
In the Star Wars universe. I think there are moments of the streaming series in which, and we won't talk much about that here, but there are moments in which you feel that there's a little bit more of that aesthetic. But then it's usually given away.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
For audience service or for the service of this kind of legacy, these legacy characters.
Right. So I think we should get into our categories of appraisal of Rogue One. I think we agreed that we were going to try and stick with the sort of 3-part structure that we'd adopted when we were talking about episode 4, which was to talk first of all about some of the political analogies that are in some ways on the surface of the text of Rogue One. Then we would revisit this question of the mythic structures that were certainly encoded in the Lucas Star Wars universe and ask whether they made a similar appearance in Rogue One. And then we talk finally about the kind of critical questions that are raised in Star Wars. As you know, I'm a big proponent of the belief that science fiction should carry some sort of utopian energy or impulse and should really be a critique of the present and at least implicitly point the way towards a better future. Even if that is just saying, don't do this thing or keep doing this thing, it will be horrible. Even if it's a dystopia, that also can have a utopian energy. Mm-hmm. And I think we should think about Rogue One in that context too. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the politics on the surface and some of the analogies that appear in Rogue One, we talked in episode 4 about is the Empire kind of the US in the Vietnam era. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's been updated in Rogue One? Has that been changed? Is there a kind of analog to the US that's imprinted in Rogue One?
I do think this is a different kind of text with regard to the analogic elements of what we're calling surface politics here. Whereas A New Hope is far less complicated, it seems to me, in terms of good versus evil, good guys versus bad guys. If there is a critique of U.S. empire in A New Hope, and we kind of couldn't really decide whether we thought that was the case or not in the last video, whether that exists or not, it is very stark. There's not a lot of ambivalence or ambiguity, it seems to me, in the ways in which either the Empire or the Rebellion are presented in A New Hope. That is very different, it seems to me, in Rogue One. Rogue One tells a different kind of story, and it suggests, given that this is 20 years on from we know of the development of Darth Vader, the ascension of Darth Vader, this kind of glorified henchman role, I suppose, for Emperor Palpatine. This is a totally different kind of vibe, it seems to me, than what we are led to believe from A New Hope. Here, the Empire does not appear to be consolidated. There appears to continue to be significant internal division and, some real cleavages between the Imperial Senate, which appears to harbor all of the rebels, and the kind of military or executive wing of the Empire, which appears to be controlled, of course, by Palpatine and Vader. Rogue One suggests that there is a lot more internal conflict between that's still existing within the Empire than what we see in A New Hope, I think. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that it is clear that the Senate is an interesting institution. As you say, it does seem to harbour not only Palpatine and his allies, but also all of the leaders of the rebellion, who are clearly still going to Senate meetings.
Yes,
but also not that often, because they're never there. You're never shown it. I mean, you're shown the Senate in the prequels. It never shows up in the original movies, and it's not in Rogue One.
Right.
And all the senators seem to be kind of secreted away on Yavin 4, running the rebellion. Yeah. So that's very interesting, and you do wonder, is Palpatine fully aware of the kind of dual lives that his senators are playing? Yeah. In the same way you do wonder, are the rebellion fully aware of the dual life that Palpatine himself seems to be forwarding?
Earlier in the sequence, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it also seems that Palpatine is, like the rebellion, operating somewhat in secret. For example, he's not really publicizing the existence or the role of Darth Vader.
Right.
Vader seems to occupy no position within either the executive, the military, or the kind of senatorial structure. He just kind of sits in his weird goo tank doing his weird things. Yeah. The Death Star is a secret, as far as I can tell.
Definitely. In fact, Vader insists that it not get out that Jeddah has been destroyed by the Death Star.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's sort of very, very interesting. So we have a political system that's full of deception, full of dual agendas, full of competing agendas, and it also doesn't seem to be functioning that much. And so the Senate doesn't seem to be, well, in some ways maybe it's like the US Senate, but the senators are not there all the time. Right? They're gone all the time. And so it seems that the Senate must only be meeting like intermittently. Right. Communications within the Empire are very sort of intermittent, it seems. And so it's a very loose, disaggregated, disorganized, chaotic political system, it seems to me, in which distance really matters, and being out on the periphery is very different than being in the metropole. And the metropole seems quite small, compared to everything else that's going on.
Yes, and first of all, we don't know where the metropole actually is.
Yes,
which kind of underscores your point about distance and what appears to be a broad and kind of untethered scope of the Empire, such as it exists. But what we also get in Rogue One is that it certainly appears that the Death Star is the instrument of consolidating Palpatine's power. And that's something, again, that in A New Hope, the power appears to already be consolidated. The power, the Empire is portrayed in A New Hope as a kind of seamless machine that almost goes of itself. Whereas in Rogue One, you can really see the strings still being pulled from behind the curtain. And it's this mass weapon of destruction that is held out as the instrument of consolidating power. And that, I think, gives us entry into a whole series of kind of backroom political dealings, or as you say, just lack of communication, that has not been presented up to this point in the Star Wars universe.
In terms of analogies, Gareth Edwards has said that he saw Galen Erso as a Robert Oppenheimer figure. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project. What do you make of those? I mean, that's two analogies, right?
Yeah.
Urso as Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
and the Death Star as a nuclear weapon.
WMD.
Yes.
Yeah. I think one of the great achievements of Rogue One, and we've both noticed this upon rewatching it, is the way that it really portrays the Death Star as a deliverer of atom bombs. Right? It's the Death Star is now, because of the way that Rogue One presents the destruction that it wreaks down upon its victims, the Death Star is now positioned, it seems to me, in the mythic history of 20th century America. And you see this every time that the weapon is deployed. We see it in Jeddah. There's a mushroom cloud that develops as a result of the impact of the weapon. And then these energy waves, right, that just kind of careen out and metastasize across the landscape. We see it in the destruction of Jeddah. We see it in the culminating scene of the film in the destruction of Scarif. The analogies here to nuclear warfare, to the dropping of the atom bomb, it seems to me couldn't be more clear and obvious, but something we've never seen before, right? And so it portrays the Death Star as, because it's a weapon of mass destruction, it really lodges this storytelling, as I say, in the mythic history of 20th century America. And that is also, it strikes me, as quite revealing and interesting and unique.
And so does that...
And so I should say, it's just to follow up, so yes, the Galen Erso is the Oppenheimer figure.
Right.
This is the conflicted, brilliant scientist who, on one hand, his brilliance comes to the fore forever and always in the construction of this superweapon. On the other hand, he is conflicted the entire time about doing it. And this is somebody who understands the deep immorality, or perhaps amorality, of what it is that he's doing. And so this is a conflicted figure in the exact way that those Los Alamos scientists were in the early 1940s.
There is, of course, the legendary story of Robert Oppenheimer witnessing the successful Trinity test in the Los Alamos desert and saying, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." However, someone who was stood next to Oppenheimer at the time says that what he actually said was, and that this was a kind of post-facto thing that he said to appear very sort of, intelligent and educated and so forth. So who knows the truth?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that Rogue One is missing, it seems to me, is a picture or a scene with Galen Erso wearing the deep goggles, right? Shielding himself from the blast, from the aftermath of the atomic explosion, right? With his hair kind of flying up in the back. Right. And it's not the only way, right, in which Edwards situates this text, it seems to me, in the mythic history of 20th and early 21st century America. Mm-hmm. The scenes in Jeddah, the battle scenes in Jeddah themselves, are clearly an analog to urban warfare during the Iraq War.
Yes. Yeah, and that's very striking. I mean, it's a really direct representation of that, and a really direct quotation of that, and the images say that to anyone who, was alive during that period and watched the news during that period. It also carries or reinforces the deeper message about the dispersed nature of this empire. And of course, one of the big US problems in Iraq was the difficulty of kind of force projection when you're so far from home and amongst people who don't want you to be there. It's actually really difficult to impose your will by force, even though you're this, techno hyperpower, locally on the ground, far from home, you do not have a lot of advantages. And that clearly is the problem that the Empire is suffering in Jeddah and some of its some of their other far-flung outposts.
Yeah, although while the battle scenes are themselves analogic to Iraq War, urban warfare, the overall dynamic, it seems to me, of what's happening in Jeddah is more analogic to old-timey colonial administrative colonialism. Because after all, what is it that the empire is doing in Jeddah? Well, they're resource extracting.
Yes.
Right? They're essentially stealing the crystals for the making of the Death Star.
Yes.
So the analog here is direct, it seems to me, right? So this is another way in which we might revisit, that kind of unclear or creaky idea that the New Hope is portraying the Empire as late-era U.S. imperialism. Here, it seems like Edwards is portraying it more as late-era British colonialism, British Empire stuff.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And the other thing you get out of this portrayal of the Death Star being built as a project is you get sort of bureaucratic politics. I mean, the actual Manhattan Project it didn't take place in Manhattan, it took place at several sites, several far-flung sites, and it involved bureaucracies and organizations doing big things and sort of interpersonal rivalries. I mean, Oppenheimer had this huge rivalry with General Groves, the military head of the project, and in fact the collaboration between the military and the scientists was enormously fraught for all the reasons that you would expect, that they just come from entirely different organizational cultures. And actually the figure of Krennic and how he behaves compared to Urso is a nice dramatization of Oppenheimer and Groves in the Manhattan Project. And Krennic he's a sort of middle manager, and he does middle manager things, and he's did the Emperor, will he hear about this?
Right.
Well, I might get a promotion, I might get a 10 out of 10 merit score or something, and he's just this kind of grubby little
right. And who is, by the way, very clearly in thrall to Galen Erso.
Yes.
And Erso knows this, because at some point he recognizes that, I'm replaceable. Right? Krennic doesn't realize this. I'm not the only scientist who can figure out how to develop the Death Star.
Finish this thing. The hard work is done.
Yeah. And so I have to make myself seem more indispensable than I actually am, which just underscores Krennic's kind of barely cognizant understanding scientifically of what's actually happening.
Which was also, I'm afraid, true of General Groves in the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
So we also get some more information on the Rebel Alliance, which I had said in our discussion of episode 4 was incompletely sketched out, so that you couldn't really tell how it was going to work, or how it did work. A lot of its leadership structure was mysterious. In Rogue One, you learn a lot more. And I mean, Mon Mothma's is in the movie quite a lot, and she's the actual leader. She's making decisions. You see the Rebel Alliance in operation. You see the kind of council. She calls them counselors, right? The people who are advising her. They're making a decision. Should we fight now that we know that the Death Star is vulnerable, but also obviously very, very difficult to attack? Or do we just kind of fold our hands, saying we've been out-teched here and we've just got to learn to live within the Empire? What did you pick up on about the Rebel Alliance in this movie?
So to me, the overriding message that's being presented here is that the Rebel Alliance is inept. We have displayed for us both a scenario in which a critical error or critical fault can be exploited in this superweapon. But we also have evidence of the superweapon's impact. And what we get is not a willingness to engage, not the sign that comes to the Rebel Alliance that this is the moment with their back against the wall, that it's either now or never. But instead you get a group of feckless and cowardly leaders of the Rebel Alliance who very clearly refuse to engage and who seek to surrender. Scared of war, right? Which is also something that we learned for the first time. I think in A New Hope, we very clearly get the sense that this has been an ongoing civil war. But here in Rogue One, there's no evidence, in fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that there's been any meaningful battlefield engagement up to this point. And so I think the message that we get is that the democracy, the proto-democracy that is intended by the Rebel Alliance appears to be inept and not up to meeting the threat of the day. And that's a quite dispiriting message, it seems to me.
Well, because the Rebel Alliance is extremely diverse, right? It includes people from all different worlds who quite naturally face different levels of immediate threat from the Empire, occupy, I presume, different positions within its socio-economic and political structures, come from very different cultures. And what you want to believe is that diversity is tremendous and democratic decision making is going to produce the best possible outcome. As you say, the message of Rogue One is that the more diverse people's interests are and the more democratic your procedures are, the more veto points you have and the less likely you are to take the decision. I mean, in time of war, we should perhaps not overdraw this point, but in time of existential threat, the less likely you are to get to the decision that you need to get to do the thing that's necessary to continue the fight.
Yes, and so the only response, the movie is very clearly saying, is to go rogue. And this is what we see, right?
Yes.
First we see our group of protagonists who essentially refuse the orders, just totally subvert the leadership chain, and go out and steal a ship on their own, steal the Empire, steal back, or steal again, I guess, the already stolen cargo ship from the Empire, and they go it alone. And then, even more troublingly, I think, we see, well, what is it that we see that's even more troubling than just a rogue group of fighters?
Well, what's his face just takes the whole fleet off on his own. He's
the
like, I'm
military
going to
commander,
fight.
right? The Rebel Alliance military commander, Radis, just completely, essentially steals all the military.
Yes, and they all follow him.
And they all follow. And Mon Mothma follows as well.
Yeah.
So the message here that's being offered about, again, maybe it's limited to times of existential threat, but in a culture that is prone, as we are in kind of early to mid 21st century life, a culture that is prone to seeing existential threats everywhere, and sometimes very clearly facing actual existential threats. The message about democratic politics and about the possibility of democratic publics to participate meaningfully and effectively in time of crisis, the message here is very dispiriting.
So let me draw you an analogy and see if you go with this. It's a little bit of a hot take. Mm-hmm. Are you ready?
Yeah.
The Rebel Alliance is the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
The Rogues are progressive activists. Mon Mothma is Biden, Pelosi, well, Joe Manchin, centrist moderates. Does that... Do you buy that? It's a hot take.
I think it maybe works. It's scorching hot. I think it maybe works for the contemporary moment, but it can also be rewound, and I think it can also be used to make sense of interpartisan conflicts writ large, because one could make the same case that this is the message that conservative activists draw, American conservative activists draw and realize in the 1950s and 1960s, that they are engaged in some kind of existential cultural warfare, and that winning over through democratic means, the levers of power and decision making is inefficient or ineffective. And so, in other words, it seems to me you could turn the analogy on its head, right? And maybe the more pressing or persuasive analogy is not that this is Democratic Party, current Democratic Party versus progressive wing, but that this is what happens, or this is potentially what happens when you've got a firebrand group of partisans versus a kind of establishment that is accreted over in very particular and conventional ways of doing things. And when the environment is constructed as one that is existential in character.
It does raise the interesting question, though, of, I mean, it's Star Wars rather than Star political strategy or whatever. Yeah. But what if the rebels just went public with all this? Said, well, the Emperor's a nut. He's got this weirdo Vader who lives in like a goo chamber and does weird stuff, whatever, in the goo. He spent all the damn money on on this Death Star. He's blowing stuff up randomly. People of the Empire, why not vote the bums out?
Well, it's an excellent question, because we don't actually know if that's possible.
Yes, we don't, because we don't know the full state of the atrophy of the political system, or
how it's designed to work.
Precisely. Yeah, yes, we don't know if that was if the Senate was actually a directly elected thing. It's got this polyglot monarchical politics clearly on some worlds, which suggests it's a delegatory rather than a representative body. Interesting. Okay, good.
Yeah.
last thing on surface politics and analogies, Professor. You had raised an interesting parallel between a new character that we see, Saw Gerrera, and Darth Vader, and that is an interesting parallel. I mean, there's a point where Saw Gerrera says, "There's not that much left of me," indicating he's this sort of cyborg figure. In the same way that Vader is.
Indeed, and he is. And there's the scene at which we first... It's not the scene where we first meet Saw Gerrera. Of course, we first meet Saw Gerrera when he rescues Jyn Erso as a girl. But when we are reintroduced to Saw Gerrera, the kind of elderly freedom fighter, or extremist, as the Alliance refers to him, the first thing we see of him is he's walking with robotic prosthetic legs. Right, and then the camera kind of pans up, and what you very clearly get the sense of is that this is a guy who is essentially still alive because of machines, down to his breathing apparatus, which is literally, I think, the exact same technology that Darth Vader is relying upon as well. And so physically, the parallels are manifest and clear. But it seems to me that they're also manifest and clear when you look at the ways in which both Saw Gerrera and Darth Vader are positioned in relation to the power structures that they exist within. So Saw Gerrera has been exiled essentially from the Rebel Alliance because he's an extremist, right? Or considered an extremist. Somebody who does things like, in Jeddah City, attack Imperial convoys. He's an extremist. He exists clearly at the periphery of the power structure that makes up the Alliance. Well, so is Darth Vader. Darth Vader, in fact, is so peripheral to the power structure that makes up the Empire that he's kind of disavowed, or just as you've alluded to earlier, an unknown figure. So unknown, in fact, that later on in the current Obi-Wan Kenobi series, Obi-Wan has no idea that Darth Vader, that Anakin Skywalker still lives. And this is 10 years down the road. And he's just learning for the first time that Darth Vader exists. So these are peripheral figures. They're both extremists in their own way. Vader is a religious extremist, essentially, right? But Saw Gerrera is an extremist as well, right? And their dedications to the cause means that they are both dysfunctional interpersonal characters.
Okay, so this is our break. We're recuperating at this very moment. You know what makes me feel...
My last soliloquy was so stunning that it literally dropped like a bomb.
It hit me.
There was no follow at all.
I'm stunned. I'm stunned by the depth and breadth of your soliloquy.
Yeah.
Would I be stunned on a more regular basis, Professor,
Yes.
were I to be able to take classes with you?
Indeed.
In some sort of program, perhaps the Yukon Master's Degree in Politics and Popular Culture.
Indeed you would be. This is a program that we've been developing for some time. We've got a variety of classes and a variety of other professors like us. It's not just the two of us. There are people who are even more charming than we are, well, fair enough. Hard to get more charming than what you see right now. But there are others as well. We've got classes in the area of popular culture and music. We've got classes in the area of popular culture and horror. We've got politics and horror, I should say, politics and music. We've got classes in the area of politics and speculative fiction, right? In addition to classes that Professor Dyson teaches on science fiction specifically, and ones that I teach in the area of conceptions of heroism and villainy, and also in the area of intersections between representations of law and popular culture.
Sounds terrific, Prof. Where would I go to find out more?
You would go to the Yukon Political Science webpage, where you will find...
It's just appeared, I mean, that's remarkable. It appeared, but wait. It appeared above there, the address, and down below in the description.
This is a program that articulates both in the regions of heaven and in the depths of hell, clearly.
That's very good. I think that's the ad. And we're back. part 2 of our desecration. It's not a desecration, that's a negative thing. It's a dissection, appreciation of Rogue One. We want to move to the level of political myths that are encoded in this text, if any. This was, I think, a rather crucial part of our understanding of Episode 4 and a rather crucial part of the George Lucas mythos of Star Wars. Of course, he sold the franchise by this point, so we have different authors carrying this story forward. They're not necessarily bound to the same mythical stories and structures that George Lucas was. Let me ask you very directly, Professor, are all the myths out the window in this one?
No, I don't think they're all out the window, but it strikes me as ironic now that you mention it, that Lucas sells his franchise to Disney, which is in the business of fable making, which is literally in the business and has the history of being myth makers. And yet, the first entry in this Star Wars story universe severely plays down the kinds of deep human myth that articulate at the level of archetype that we see in Episode 4. Here, as we've talked about before, earlier, I think that we're more in the realm of mythic history. We're more in the realm of, and particularly of mythic military history. To the extent that there's callbacks and historical reference here, I think they are much more specific than most of what we get in Episode 4, and that they are much more clearly lodged in modern military warfare.
And much more, I would say, about structure than agency. I mean, the mythic stories are often about great individuals, Odysseus and Luke Skywalker and so on and so forth. Extraordinary people doing amazing things and kind of upending history.
Yes.
The great person, the great man, theory of history.
Yes.
Whereas in this movie, I think you see, as you said, ordinary people whose lives are being shaped and impinged upon by events and structures that are massively beyond their control.
Exactly. And human meaning here is found in these kinds of quieter interactions. Human meaning is not found, as you say, in the development of elite mythical characters who engage with one another and cause the ground to shake and the ground to move. The tectonic movement that's taking place in this story revolves around these smaller kinds of interactions involving situated, contextualized people who find themselves, as we've said, in circumstances emphatically not of their making.
Yeah, and I think you can see some of the differences in the central protagonists, and in Episode 4 you get Luke and Leia are these sort of mythic figures, the great man who goes off to find his destiny, the hero's journey, then the princess, and the kind of analogues in Episode 4 are much more grounded figures. Like Jyn Erso is a very different protagonist than Princess Leia. I mean, she's someone who's suffered tremendous deprivation and pain in her background. She's not a princess. She's the daughter of a scientist, but actually an exiled scientist. It's a very different sort of backstory. It's one though that I think makes it easier for me to engage with and take the mythic figures in Episode 4, because I now see them as one type of actor that exists in the Star Wars universe and one take on this story, and not the only take on this story, because I've got the counterpoints in Rogue One.
Yeah.
And it makes me appreciate the different register of Episode 4 more than if it was all just myth.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, as we alluded to earlier, this is really the first entry in the Star Wars universe writ large that is a story about ordinary people. Up to this point, if you think about all of the different portrayals of the non-elite characters in the Star Wars universe, the only ones who are really infused with any kind of interest or meaning or backstory are non-human. Interestingly, droids are given more personality in the most of the Star Wars universe than are other human beings. And this is one of the first moments in which you get the sense that this galactic battle is playing out in the realm of ordinary life. not everything is mythic. Not everything is iconic or legendary that takes place. There is a kind of everyday groundedness to this conflict. And it seems to, as you alluded to earlier, impact different people in different ways.
And I think, while you can always go too far with auteur theory, I think it is not a coincidence that George Lucas was said famously to be an introverted person, and a person who, he couldn't understand how to direct his actors, he couldn't give them notes on how to portray emotion and so forth, and seemed rather uninterested in human depth and so forth, and rather naturally drawn to, on the one hand, human archetypes that actually don't really exist, mythical archetypes, and the droids were much more interesting and perhaps less threatening to him than the kind of real humans.
Right.
Whereas Gareth Edwards, I think, said in an interview we both listened to, that he was interested in presenting real people, and real people are not just black and white in moral terms, right? Everyone's a shade of grey. Everyone has their challenges and does bad things as well as good things. I think it's no coincidence that if you were to look at Gareth Edwards' earlier movies, and in particular movie Monsters, the first movie that he made for almost no money, that is a genre movie about sort of science fiction and monsters, but it's not really about that. It's about two actually quite unattractive central characters, and they're realising the mistakes they've made in their lives and coming to some sort of resolution. And Rogue One stands in a line with I think, Monsters, which is a great movie.
Contrast dialogue as well.
Yes.
The lines that are spoken by these actors are lines that you can imagine overhearing.
Yes.
Right? Nothing that George Lucas writes is, what's Harrison Ford's old...
George, you can type this stuff, but you sure as heck can't say it.
You can't say it.
Version of that.
Exactly. And that's part of what's going on, right? Is that there's a deep interest here, it seems to me, in humanity in Rogue One that is not always on display in the larger Star Wars universe.
Yeah, I think that's right. I have another hot take for you. Here it is. Vader is clearly a mythic figure still in Rogue One. I mean, it's very hard to sort of reconstruct him as, just a workaday, ordinary person. He really has to have that mythical element. In Episode 4, Vader is the embodiment of evil, and he stands for that, and he's that kind of mythic representation of the, what do you call him, like the dark cowboy or the dark figure that rides into town. In Rogue One, let me put it to you, all humans are so morally ambivalent and conflicted on both sides. The Rebel Alliance, they're spies and assassins and saboteurs, and they're very haunted by the things they've done. In the Empire, they're kind of out for themselves, and they're kind of grasping middle managers and the like, or people who are just following orders and not engaging their moral humanity. Vader's the only pure character. He's the only pure person. He sees right through all of the Imperial apparatchiks around him, and he's just like, you're all a bunch of ambition-driven snakes. He has no time for the rebellion, who I presume he would say are just causing chaos and destruction, including to themselves, instead of just submitting to the natural, or at least inevitable order of things. Is Vader the only decent person?
No, he's not decent.
Okay.
Let's be very clear, and I'll follow up that in a moment. But he has the purity. Vader has the purity of the convert. He has the purity of somebody who is a pure ideologue, who believes fully. It's not clear that he believes fully in the mission of the Empire, which we're told is to bring peace and order to the universe. But he certainly believes in the purity of his role as a submissive to Palpatine. And that to the extent that he seems to be able to find any meaning in his life anymore, it is in that role as a submissive.
Okay.
Right? That's, I think, what's happening. But he's not a decent person. So there's a purity of intention, for sure. He's not a liar, right? And he's not a careerist. And he's not driven, does not appear to be driven by those kinds of terrestrial considerations. But he's not a decent person. And in fact, what Rogue One does so effectively in the few scenes in which we see Vader, particularly the final scene, just before they scurry the plans off momentarily into hyperspace, this is a terrifying character. His power here is at its peak. He commits mass murder literally with the wave of a hand. he is portrayed in a way that is far more terrifying than I think he's ever portrayed in the Lucas movies. And he's still at the height of his powers here, which by the time Luke Skywalker confronts him, he's not. He's an old man by this point. But here, he's a terrifying character. I don't think he's decent.
Yes.
Right? But there is a purity of intention. I agree.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a sidebar before we finish this section. I don't think we've given Gareth Edwards enough credit as a director so far, just for the pure aesthetic choices that he makes, the look of the movie. It's a beautiful movie, and when you mentioned that Vader scene, I know there's some controversy about whether that was always intended to be in the movie or it was tacked on at the end. I just think that scene works for the reasons that you talked about. Like, you were shown why Vader is so effective and terrifying. But it's also a beautiful scene of movie making. Like when you hear him first and then you see the lightsaber, kind of the red lightsaber light up. That's tremendous. There are so many moments in this movie that are just stunningly beautiful. There's a moment in the battle on the beach where you see the AT-AT for a second and then it's kind of hidden behind clouds and then it re-emerges and that's terrifying. There's the absolutely beautiful shot, I think it's the best shot in the movie, of after the Death Star strikes Jeddah City. It's the mushroom cloud you talked about, but then there's this great plume of rock and debris and everything that makes it, I think, all the way into orbit just below a giant Star Destroyer, and it's just a absolutely perfect movie-making shot.
I agree. The aesthetics here are spectacular, and there's two scenes for me that really stand out. The first is that, to return to the Battle of Scarif, where there's a scene in which you have a rebel fighter that crashes, air fighter that crashes into the beach, and at the exact moment that it crashes into the beach, you see the rebels on the ground, right, kind of emerging into their own firefight, and the transition is perfect. The other scene is literally the first one of the movie, right, when Krennic is going to basically abduct Galen Erso, and we see the Krennic's aircraft flying over the beach and flying over the water. It's a stunning cinematography, and one that calls back to one of your favorite moments from Episode 4, the two suns that Luke stares off into in Tatooine.
Gareth Edwards.
Yeah.
He's good.
Yeah, it's extremely impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's take a brief break, and then we will be back with part 3. maybe not. And we're back for the third and final part of our appreciation of Rogue One. I think we're going to talk in this section about the critical nature of Rogue One. Is this a critical text? Does it contain, as I would argue, science fiction really has a duty to contain, some sort of prefigurations of utopia, some path to a better world, or at least some warning about the path not to take? Does it do that kind of progressive utopian work? I think we'd said when we talked about Episode 4 that it sort of struggled as a text, and it perhaps in this realm, and it perhaps struggled, this is Episode 4 we're talking about, because it wasn't really science fiction. I think that's not an argument we can use towards Rogue One, which I think is much more science fictional, and we can perhaps talk about why. I mean, maybe you don't agree, but we can perhaps talk about why that's the case as we get into this set of arguments. So, Rogue One is critical text. Episode 4 had a problem. It was full of monarchies, full of elites, and full of magic. And those are things that make it very, very difficult for a science fictional text to be in meaningful and reasonable conversation with our world and to be outlining a progressive future. Many people argue they make that difficult. I'm not saying that's a universally accepted position. Rogue One, no monarchies. I don't think, not really. I mean, they're very peripheral to it. It's not a story of elites, story of ordinary people. The Force, not I would argue, a crucial part of the plot, and is actually subverted in some ways, I would say, by some of the characters. Does this put Rogue One more in this critical utopian sphere? I
mean, it's interesting, first to think about the way that the Force does and doesn't work. So So obviously we have one character who is extremely facile with the Force, and that's Vader.
Yes.
And we see him, as we talked about earlier, employed in the most terrifying of ways.
But crucially, I don't mean to cut you off here, Professor, but crucially in ways that are militarily effective.
Yes.
Right? He does it to accomplish a discrete... It's not just magic, right? He doesn't teleport to... he does it to like very quickly dispose of all these troops and get to the place where he needs to go.
Right. And we get the keeper of the crystals, right? Who is of the wills. And this was interesting. We were talking earlier. He doesn't actually use the Force. I think you're right about that, because every time that we see him intuit something, it's just a response to he's heard something, right? Or he's felt something.
So this is the Donnie Yen character whose name I keep forgetting. Inuit?
Yeah, something like
that.
Quinnet?
It says something.
Quinnet, maybe?
Yes.
Dear viewers, you'll know it.
This is the kind of high-level, precise analysis that you get.
It's not written on a page.
With two PhDs. No, if it's not two PhDs watching a movie. If it's not on the page, we don't know what it is. Wikipedia would have been useful. But the Donnie Yen character, who is blind, displays extraordinary abilities. But I would argue your reading of this movie does sort of hinge in an important way on whether you think his abilities are extraordinary because he's channeling the Force, which is what he perhaps hints at, although I'm not sure he totally believes it, or whether you think he is a man who is blind, who has developed a reliance on on his other senses, and so has a particularly acute sense of hearing and spatial awareness, and kind of uses those in ways that are exceptional and extraordinary, but are not magical or beyond the capacities of human beings per se.
And not only that, it strikes me that at the culminating moment where we might be inclined to see him as some kind of force-bearing human, when he walks out into the firefight to connect the uplink.
Yes.
Actually, he's walking straight through the fire.
Yes.
There's no evidence that he is, changing his movements, changing his gait, his pace. He's not stopping at all.
Yes.
That seems to point more to the chaos and just the inefficiency of gunfire or of blaster fire, right? In the moment in the heat of the moment, and his colleague, who then comes to his end by also doing the kind of the religious invocation of the Force. That doesn't work at all.
No. And his superpower is he has a massive gun.
So I think that's right. I mean, there's a real, pulling back on the mystical elements, right, of the action here in a way that is more suggestive of human capability and probably more in line with science fiction expectations.
And I think crucially there's not just, at least as I read it, there's not just the dialing back of the magic, there's the dialing up of the utopian imperative to strive and to believe in things. And what are the superpowers of the Donnie Yen character and I think he's called Baze Melbus, the guy with the big gun. It's particularly Donnie Yen's character. The superpower is the faith that he has.
Belief.
Yes, and that's why he's able to do these things and to hone his skills. And that walking across the field of fire is an act of faith.
Yes.
An act of, I will make this because it's particularly important for me to do this. Or rather, I think even more movingly, I would say, and inspiringly, I will not make this. And I'm pretty certain I'm actually going to get killed here.
Yes.
But I'm going to do this anyway because it's important to strive for a better tomorrow.
Yes, which also underscores a couple of points here, but that underscores the droid K's consistent recitation of the poor odds of these missions.
Right.
And the Cassian character played by Diego Luna is constantly saying, don't tell me those, I don't care. Right. This is what we're doing.
Right.
The other thing that's going on here that I think undermines the mysticism in some ways of the Star Wars universe is the kyber crystals themselves. There's nothing mystical about these things. These are raw materials that are pulled out of the ground that are used like uranium might be used in a variety of different ways It's true that they are used to make lightsabers, but the exact same technology that's used to make a lightsaber is used to make a Death Star. And Jyn Erso's engagement with kyber crystals is entirely her necklace, right?
Yes.
That's given to her by her mother as a symbol.
Yes.
Right? So even this, what would appear to be most elemental of crystals, right? Supernatural in their powers, are shown in Rogue One to simply be ordinary materials that are mined from the earth, from the worlds.
And this rather crucially closes a gap between the two great science fictional texts of the 60s and the 70s, Star Wars and Star Trek, which was seen to have this giant cleavage between them because Star Wars relied on the Force. Well, Star Trek had elements that you could see as magical if you wanted, like warp speed. Well, warp speed was achieved by these things called dilithium crystals, which focused energy and etc. and so forth. And it's beyond our technology, but it's not a scientifically implausible notion should that resource be discovered. Dilithium crystals had to be mined and they wore out. And this is, I think, Edwards putting the Star Wars universe actually in a very Trekkian direction at that point. There's other kind of utopian things that show up in Rogue One that I think are interesting, at least just to state, in terms of dialogue. The exchange that's had between Cassian and Jyn Erso, where Cassian's trying to convince Jyn Erso to join his part of the rebellion. He says, "Well, aren't you bothered by the Imperial flag flying across the galaxy?"
It's actually Saw Gerrera.
Oh, is that Saw Gerrera? Yeah. Okay, so I'm misremembering the factionalism here.
Yeah.
Aren't you bothered by the Imperial flag flying over the galaxy? And Jyn Erso says, "Well, it's not a problem as long as you don't look up."
Yeah.
And that's a rather crucial utopian point. I mean, the point being that you cannot live without looking up.
And it's a callback.
Forward.
It's also a callback in that moment to earlier in the movie, the beginning of the movie, where Jyn is hiding. She's been hid away, on her home planet. And when she looks up, what does she see? She sees the face of the rebellion.
Yes.
Right. So don't look up, and you won't see.
Yes.
These things that you don't have control over.
Yes.
Now, of course, she's wrong about that. Right. Human beings are situated and contextualized in circumstances that they never have control over, and you still have to figure out a way to navigate.
Right.
But it's a clever throwback, right?
Yes.
It's as though she has convinced herself if she hadn't have looked up,
right,
she would not have gotten herself into this.
Right.
Again, she's wrong.
Right.
But
yes. And as you say, humans in this universe and in our world as well are put in situations that they can't have control over. But the utopian impulse is that humans gradually and sequentially gain control over those circumstances, not by dint of mythic deeds by special anointed ones, but by collective efforts. And those efforts may well involve sacrifice, and they're likely to be incremental and so forth. And Rogue One, in a sense, is in that universe.
It's interesting. I
sense you're going to disagree with me.
Is this a utopian movie, or is it an old-timey existentialist story in the neighborhood of Camus or Sartre, right, where the meaning is found in the struggle? Because what we know about what's going to happen, and as we talked about last week in the Star Wars universe, is that everything is just going to be circular.
Yes.
It's going to be a kind of an unending fight against corruption and totalizing power, but the corrupt and totalizing force is not always the Empire. Sometimes it's the Republic.
Yes.
Which gives birth to the Empire.
Right.
And on and on. And so so when the characters in Rogue One invoke hope, I wonder if they're not also really calling back to those kinds of post-World War II existentialist texts like The Stranger, like The Plague, in which the overriding message is that human meaning exists, but not because it's linked to some kind of teleological end of history, but rather it exists in struggle. It exists in the moment. It exists in trying. Because I think that's what these characters are doing.
Yeah.
The meaning they're getting is out of acting.
So this then takes this part of the discussion in a darker direction.
Yes.
Because it does suggest that we are still in a history that is going to be cyclical and circular and not unidirectional
Yeah.
in a positive
Yeah.
direction. And if human meaning is only in struggle and sacrifice, but those things are kind of never go anywhere cumulatively. They just, as the movie does themselves, they self-dismantle and these characters do all die.
Yeah.
This is not then a hopeful movie.
No.
It's as negative as episode 4. It just in a different way. It's negative in a way that, you know, acknowledges the utopian potential and necessity of individuals working to change structures, working collectively.
Yeah.
It doesn't rely on or doesn't fall into the mythic traps that foreclose utopian possibilities by casting everything into the supernatural realm or into the monarchical realm or into the past. But it is equally closed as a progressive system of thought.
Yeah, I mean, think back to one of the 20th century's most consequential utopianisms, which is this sort of version of communism or socialism, right? And it's critically, that vision, that Marxist vision, relies upon an end of history thesis, just exactly the same as the Christian end of times vision or the Christian paradise vision relies upon an end of history. But in the Marxist version, right, the end point is wholly inconsistent with the materialist theory of history that gets you allegedly to that point, right? The materialist theory of history is all about struggle. It's all about class struggle in particular, and that meaning is found through class struggle, which makes the teleological end of history, you know, internally incoherent. And so what we've got here is, it's kind of a head fake, right? You've got gestures towards utopian possibilities, but in fact the entire mechanics of how one might reach the utopian outcome belies and gives lie to the very possibilities, right? So it's an internally incoherent desire, and I think Rogue One can be read as doing a much better and more successful job of illustrating that than some of the other Star Wars texts.
Okay. The other...
But also makes it very different again from Star Trek.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, in Star Trek, the sort of seen as the grand sort of utopian text of the of the 20th century in science fictional terms. Although there is some debate, I mean, this may be a different video. There's some debate about even that. And maybe at some point I think if we do a series of these and we always conclude that, well, this isn't really utopian and it's not doing critical work, we might actually have to try and find some positive cases, otherwise we're left with an empty set.
I think it is doing critical work. It's just that critical work, I think, is more persuasively dislodged from a utopian frame.
Yes.
Or it's a critical take on the notion of utopian frames themselves, right? And so maybe what this is a text, this might ironically be a text that is at war with science fiction itself.
Interesting. Star Wars with science fiction.
Yeah,
the meta movie.
Yeah,
no one wants to see,
because this is a movie. I mean, this is a movie about trauma.
Yes,
it's a movie about trauma, and it's very clearly its historical reference are references to human trauma. And so what we get, if you imagine this as a post-World War II kind of movie, right, then you're lodging it in this realm of existential terror and trauma and doubt. And I think that puts a different spin on, like, for example, the Battle of Scarif, which is a World War II.
Yeah.
And it's an homage to World War II scenes.
Yeah.
Of storming the beach at Normandy and other kinds of, or the Pacific arena.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so, because it's a movie about trauma and about the lasting effects of trauma and what seems to me maybe about the inevitability of trauma, I don't know that it's a clear path to a kind of science fiction-y investment in the notion of progressive utopian futures.
Yeah. Which is two points.
But it's still critical.
Yes.
Yeah.
2 points to make on this. One is Gareth Edwards said that a lot of the storyboards for this movie or a lot of the pre-shooting visualization was done by taking war zone footage from World War II and other wars and literally photoshopping kind of stormtroopers into the picture and rebellion uniforms and saying, wow, this looks really, really compelling. I'd really like to see this movie. The other interesting question that this raises is whether this movie is even science fiction at all. As you know, that there is a debate within science fiction studies about how many movies that are called science fiction are science fiction. And there is even the kind of ultra extremist position, which is 2001 is the only science fiction movie, because even the other great science fiction movies are all at best cross genre movies or genre movies in another genre with some science fiction element that is not actually crucial. Like Blade Runner is a noir detective movie, Alien is a horror movie, maybe Rogue One is a World War II war movie, and there's nothing quintessentially or essentially science fictional about it, which is an interesting avenue to explore.
What we get hints of, it seems to me, in the Star Wars universe, and it's most clearly illustrated here in Rogue One, is that violence as the mechanism, mass violence as the mechanism towards utopian futures, is highly problematic. Not necessarily because it's obviously ineffective or morally reprehensible, but rather because of the lasting trauma that it enacts. The idea of utopian futures, it seems to me, posit a humanity that is somehow deeply functional and has somehow reconciled itself to all of the things that took place on the path to utopia. And it seems to me that what Rogue One is telling us is that those things are not possible. That one of the reasons why a utopian future is a false dawn is because it imagines a space in which human beings are free of history, are free of personal history and structure, structured history, and mythic history, as we see here. And that's not possible.
But that's a profoundly depressing statement.
Indeed.
Right? Humans, if you can't believe in humans being at peace with and free from the negative aspects of their history and gaining control over those parts of themselves that preclude a utopia. So if you can't believe in utopia, you do, I'm afraid, find yourself believing only in these cycles of violence and negativity.
But it's not necessarily that, right? That is one outcome, one possibility. But in Rogue One, it seems to me, again, tells a different story, which is that meaning is found in struggle. Meaning is found in hope. And even if we understand on some level that there will not be a utopian outcome, the commitment to other human beings, right? The care for others, the struggle to make the world a better place, not a utopian place necessarily, but a better place, is highly important and highly motivating and is in fact meaningful. So this is a story maybe that's at war with the notion of a utopian future that might get lodged into a science fiction-y kind of frame. But on the other hand, it's a movie that seems to testify to the way in which human beings can make meaning with one another in the struggle, in the engagement. I don't think it's a depressing text in that way.
Yes, except I think a utopian would say that the meanings that you've outlined, if they are not on a teleological upward trajectory with a possible endpoint of a utopia, are quite meagre satisfactions and are, unfortunately, not wholly distinguishable from the sort of false satisfactions that we would be offered by the status quo powers that be in a capitalist system or a system of violence.
Sure. I think the response to that is how depressing is a failed utopia? How depressing, how crushing is it to believe in something that's impossible? That would be, I think, the retort. Isn't there...
It's only impossible because you don't believe hard enough. I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me.
But he's not, actually.
Well, true.
right?
Good point.
This is something that's being yoked because it helps reinforce the need for action. It's a motivating tool.
Yeah.
Right? And it exists in the world of humanity, not in the world of mysticism.
Yeah. Now, Professor, if I was to go full comrade on you,
Yeah.
I would suggest that our unearthing of an unending history within the Star Wars universe that seems to require the same story being told again and again rather conveniently fits with the commercial imperatives of the
It sure does.
Disney Movie
Yes.
Corporation,
Yeah.
which will therefore be able to endlessly reproduce these stories
Yes.
and stay consistent to the universe. And even if they're grilled philosophically, say, well, it's inherent in our understanding of the way that history works, and that will be perfectly coherent. Just so happens to make a hell of a lot of money along the way.
Yes, and so I think there are multiple imperatives here. The commercial imperative is paramount, for sure. They spent a
Disney,
lot of
not
money.
Paramount. Paramount's a different.
Disney spent a lot of money on this franchise. And
Paramount is Star Trek, which is doing the same thing to the Star Trek saga,
that's right.
endlessly milking this thing.
Exactly. They spent a lot of money, and they're in the business of, producing audiences, of making audiences happy, of keeping the machine going, keeping the Star Wars machine going. On the other hand, it seems to me that Disney's charge is also at this point now to turn the Star Wars universe into a folk universe, into a universe that, it has literally been dislodged from George Lucas's control. And it is now, it seems to me, part of what Disney is trying to do in an artistic way that is not simply reducible to commercial imperative, is that it is trying to create the scenario for a kind of democratization of the Star Wars universe. A universe, a series of characters, a series of plot lines and trajectories that are available to new generations of creators. To use these characters, to use these structures, to use these trajectories of story in ways that feel appropriate to new audiences. And that's a struggle for sure. That the commercial imperative versus the artistic imperative.
Yeah. Well, on that bombshell, I think we should leave it there. Yeah. Rogue One, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, excellent movie.
Great movie. Yeah. Really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Really, really added for me to my enjoyment of Episode 4.
Yeah.
I think Rogue One works as a prequel in that it's about the most successful way that a prequel could work. It doesn't diminish and in fact enhances the subsequent text.
Yep.
Works well as a standalone movie. I think, and I think we should end it there.
It's perfect.